With Britain widely known as the mother of parliaments, it is perhaps appropriate that when ours opens for business, we do things somewhat differently to the rest of the world. Take the gilded, horse-drawn carriage taking the monarch from Buckingham Palace to the Palace of Westminster.
Black Rod!
Or that curious figure in stockings known as Black Rod, who has a door shut in their face by the very MPs the monarch is summoning. Or the King's speech itself, given from a massive golden throne to a room full of lords and ladies dressed in finery that suggests both a pending ermine shortage and that the cost of living crisis maybe doesn't quite affect us all. Yet the state opening of Parliament does serve a function, a literal statement of the government's priorities for the next Parliament, which we know will last no longer than January next year. It was also the first time Charles III delivered the speech. I'm Neil Paterson, and in this edition of the Sky News Daily, we'll pull back those thick velvet curtains and ask what we learnt. First, though, let's hear from the King.
It is mindful of the legacy of service and devotion to this country set by my beloved mother, the late Queen, that I deliver this, the first King's speech in over 70 years. My ministers will work closely with international partners to support Ukraine, strengthen NATO, and address the most pressing security challenges. This includes the consequences of the barbaric acts of terrorism against the people of Israel, facilitating humanitarian support into Gaza, and supporting the cause of peace and stability in the Middle East.
And our political editor, Beth Rigby, joins us in the studio. Let's deal with the big picture stuff first. I mean, who won, for example, the office sweepstake on how long the speech was going to be today?
Well, we weren't expecting it to be that long, and it wasn't. And in terms of actual pieces of legislation that he is seeking to lay before the next general election, it was a much sort of shorter speech and smaller in ambition than many a previous Prime Minister. To put it into context, Boris Johnson, I think, put 38 pieces of legislation down in the last Queen's speech, which was in May 2022. That was very Boris Johnson, though, because you have to go all the way back to Tony Blair in 2005 to find another Prime Minister that kind of went at that level. But it was, in terms of pieces of legislation, it was the smallest number we've seen in a decade. And I think that sort of speaks to the ambition of the government, but also the constraints that he's operating under when he has a party quite divided and there's quite a lot of stuff left out.
But surely also a factor is the fact that this Parliament will not last 5 years. I mean, if you don't have a 5-year Parliament, you can't get as many bills through.
Also, look, how would I... If I was going to take a step back, how would I frame it? I would say it's a Prime Minister running out of time and running out of space. Running out of time because we're a year out from an election probably. And yes, he hasn't got that much time to get stuff through. But even stuff he does get through, the voters won't feel it. And running out of space because he's really constrained by a parliamentary party that a big chunk of them just do not have his back. So all of those divisions in the Conservative Party that chucked Boris Johnson out and then brought Liz Truss in and chucked Liz Truss out and now have Rishi Sunak as Prime Minister, they're all still there. So there's a lot of stuff that was in the, it's too hard to do box. But then that brings it back to some of the contradictions, Neil, because he says on the one hand he wants to make difficult long-term decisions and then parks difficult pieces of legislation. He says on another hand that he wants to be the change Prime Minister. That was the whole vibe of conference. I'm going to do it differently. I'm going to end the 30-year status quo. Keir Starmer represents status quo. And then number 10 are briefing out this is continuation of delivery. So it's quite, if I'm finding it quite confusing in terms of what's the actual big picture framing that the government trying to do, and I get paid to do that. What's the voter going to make of it?
I mean, this is not an exhaustive list, is it? I mean, the Prime Minister could come forward with other legislation not mentioned by Charles III, practically, can't he?
Yeah, he can. And I mean, there was one area which is A-levels. Do you remember he was going to completely rip up the A-level system? And this was a big announcement in the conference speech. And I'm looking through it going, where is it? Where is it? You know, and I messaged someone in number 10. I was, where's the stuff on A-levels? I thought that was a big policy. You know, and they said, well, you know, we're working through it and there could be something in due course. I'm like, is that after an election or before an election? You know, and the answer is just, well, it's coming. So yes, there could be other things that are laid down. But just in terms of sort of how it's been received, I mean, this is a former cabinet minister and this is not someone that I talk to that has an axe to grind against Rishi Sunak. You know, there are some of the absolute unreconcilables. This is not one of them. You know, and they said to me it was, quote, just depressing. It stinks of we are managing, but we have lost the will to lead. He's a technocrat trying to win an election by saying we can manage the country, but to win, you have to lead. We have a big majority, but we're not making use of it. And then this person went on to say, there's nothing in this for the public to say, wow, that's interesting. You've caught my attention.
Well, let's talk about that which was in the King's speech. And again, we've got these kind of these bullet points to guide us through the thinking of the government.
Yeah.
Growing the economy, strengthening society, keeping people safe, not using sentences with more than 3 words in them when trying to describe government policy once again. What leapt out at you?
This is all framed around an election. So you kind of think, it's a programme for government. It's not. It's a framing for an election. And so the main bits that jump out for me are that. So take sentencing, yeah? So Rishi Sunak's, I'm going to be tough on law and order. We know that law and order is going to be a big theme of the election, and he does the whole life means life sentencing. Now, on the one hand, number 10 will say they're framing it as he's tough on law and order. That's a kind of core Tory territory going into any general election. But there's a political angle to this because Sir Keir Starmer used to be in a previous life the Director of Public Prosecutions. And he, you know, over a decade ago set out sentencing laws where murder didn't necessarily mean life. Where are they going with this? Well, this is all about building up, I think, attack lines on Keir Starmer's record as Director of Public Prosecutions in a way of sharpening attack lines for a general election. I would also say, Neil, that for the government to sort of talk about being tough on law and order, where they're having to actually not put people in prison at the moment, I can see what they're trying to do in laying this attack line for Starmer. But if you haven't got your own house in order, you know, it's quite hard to throw rocks at the other side because Labour will have a completely, you know, cogent rebuttal to that, which is, well, you're not even locking people up, right?
Well, exactly. And the Conservative record in government as regards law and order, crime, punishment and so on, you know, that's more recent than Keir Starmer's time as DPP.
You can see what they are trying to do. Yeah, like, take another one. You know, we've talked about the oil and gas licensing, annual oil and gas licensing. The Prime Minister saying we are basically on the side of households when we're going to be pragmatic, getting to net zero. What are you trying to do there? You're trying to pitch Keir Starmer as the kind of green zealot who's forcing through green power. It's going to push people's bills up. He's not on the side of common sense Conservatives, right? So there's an attack line there.
If the listener is sitting at home and is not a pointy-headed policy wonk or political geek like you and myself, I mean, a couple of things that I think may well have leapt out to them are policies which don't necessarily feel entirely big C Conservative. You know, for example, that eventual complete ban on smoking that will come into place, announced at the Conservative Party conference. Also, leasehold reform as well doesn't quite fit with this being the party of people who own their own homes, people who have rights over property, so on and so forth.
On the smoking ban, so if you're under 14, so you'll never be legally allowed to buy cigarettes, I think that this is sort of how I would describe it as legislative legacy for a Prime Minister, that this is actually a pet project. So I think this is a kind of moment where a Prime Minister goes, I'm in the chair and I want to introduce this. But you are right, there's a huge libertarian wing of the Conservative Party that absolutely hates it. But he will get that through because Labour are going to support it. And I think on the leaseholder issue, that they've been working on that for a long time. I would actually argue, well, I wouldn't argue, actually, Conservative backbenchers have argued it to me, that when it comes to housing, again, they see this as a moment where he could have been bold, and he has completely put this stuff into the too hard to do box. And I'm talking about planning reform. Mm-hmm. You've got Keir Starmer saying, I will take on the NIMBYs. We need more housing. I'm going to reform planning. You know, it's something you can do. It doesn't cost money, right? So at a time when there's economic constraint, or at least both parties put the straitjackets on themselves, you could actually be quite radical. But Rishi Sunak had to park all of that because of divisions in the party. And, you know, some MPs have said to me, like, look at Canada, where the Canadian Conservatives made housing one of their number one priorities. And they have won back younger voters who have completely switched off because they think that they're prioritising something they really care about. So there are sort of things, I think there's frustration on the benches, that stuff that he could have done that would have gone, I'm the change guy, I'm being bold, I want to lead, I want to do something radical, I want to get your attention, I want to win your votes. He just hasn't taken those moments.
So why on earth then did the Prime Minister get, you know, the King to introduce a bill designed to ban those rickshaws, but not quite rickshaws that you see in London? They've got a guy on a bike at the front. I mean, I think the King Charles III described it as the scourge affecting London. Maybe I know what that's all about. There's a mayoral election fast approaching, and the Conservatives want to be able to say, we did something that Sadiq Khan never wanted to, but you know, whisper it, which he couldn't because this law hasn't been passed yet.
There's a theme running through this also about antisocial behaviour as well, which I guess plays into that. Look, we are a year out from a general election. The Conservatives are 20 plus points behind in the polls. Rishi Sunak has a reducing number of opportunities in the political calendar to shift the dial with voters and get them to actually tune back in. Because when you talk to Conservative MPs, what they will say to you is people are just turned off. They've switched us off. They've had enough of the rows and the chaos under Johnson, and now they've got the COVID inquiry and Liz Truss and what happened with the economy and changing prime ministers and all the chancellors, and they're a bit fed up, right? So they've turned off. And what he needs to do to have a chance at an election win, or, you know, becoming the biggest party or whatever, is, or even just closing the gap, he needs to get them to tune back in. And, you know, is banning kind of rickshaws, or what, I can't remember what they're called, but
pedicabs. I don't know.
Is banning those in London? Is that the kind of transformative kind of leadership that is going to shift the dial for Rishi Sunak? I mean, you know, I go and ask MPs, and they are deeply underwhelmed by all of it.
OK, so let's pause there, Beth, because, of course, if we accept that the PM has failed to shift the dial to alter the public's perceptions of events, and indeed of him, then there is another big constitutional event that might well be affected, the next general election. And we will be discussing that after this. Your thesis that this is all taking us towards the next election, well, that kind of makes a lot of sense to me, in the sense that we didn't really hear an awful lot from, if anything, was cost of living crisis. On that basis, the Conservatives can't fight the next general election on the state of the economy. I understand why they're doing it on law and order. But look at the stuff that you might have expected them to mention in the King's speech here. And we've talked about, you know, framing Keir Starmer as a bit of an eco-zealot. Where was the legislation to stop councils from bringing in those low-traffic neighbourhoods? Conversion therapy ban, that's not come in. Banning tents for rough sleepers. Suella Braverman sitting right next to me, she might have expected to see that.
This goes back to what I was saying at the beginning about what this former cabinet minister was talking about managing, not leading. So it's like you've got your 5 pledges, you're trying to manage that. You've got 6 bills rolled over from the Johnson administration, which you've put into your speech. You've got a few bits and pieces which are your election attack lines. And then you've got a load of stuff that's really difficult to do, like conversion therapy, low traffic zones, pensions reform, the Mental Health Act. I think planning reform, a massive thing that they can. You know, there's the nutrient neutrality, which is changing legislation to make it easier to build more homes. All of it is the kind of it's too difficult to do, or there's splits on the benches. I mean, the counterpoint to this, Neil, is that it's a Prime Minister that is worried about divisions opening up and being very public in the party. But I would argue they're already there. I mean, you only have to pick up the Mail on Sunday and look at Nadine Dorries' serialisation of kind of her version of the downfall of Boris Johnson to see those divisions, and he's got a big majority. And in the end, what are MPs going to do? You know, are they really going to force him out? You know, he's chosen not to do that, and he's chosen not to take those risks. But I would also say one thing about that as well, Neil, which is, in defence of him, like, a King's speech is quite an abstract thing. So in Westminster, we're like, it's King's Speech Day. It's like when I used to work at the Financial Times and it was budget day, it was like, this is our moment. You know, it's budget day. We're going to own this budget.
Your version of transfer deadline day.
Yeah. So like King's Speech Day for us is like, this is a massive moment. And it is. It's a framing moment for a government to set out its mission, you know, in Parliament. So, framing what they stand for. But to the public, it's all, the Durr bill and the bar bill and the what bill and the my bar bill. Did you hear what I said there? You know what I mean? But yeah, they're not. Go at me there. The mental health bill, it's a bit meaningless, right? So your task as a Prime Minister is, one, to frame it, which is in a way to kind of speak to Westminster and get the narrative around your government. Two, you know, you might want something eye-catching in it to kind of get the attention of the audience. This was always going to be the hard moment if you were talking about Rishi resets, which we like to talk about, given that he needs to reset something in order to close the polls. Yeah. Look, he's got the autumn statement later this month. Conference speech didn't really land as they would have wanted, didn't shift the polls. This, I have no sense that this will shift the polls for them.
It just got through the day.
Yeah, but you have got the autumn statement. So when you talk about the cost of living, you know, he has got more headroom in the economic forecast. I don't know if that means he will or won't actually move on tax. The way it's been framed up to this point is kind of, you know, that's all going to come next year in the budget when you're kind of really near an election and you give everyone the tax bung and then ask them to go to the polls and vote for you again. But, you know, he has got a much more tangible moment later this month. It's only a couple of weeks away now, to try and act on some of these issues of cost of living. So I think that could be a more dynamic moment for him. But I think it is fair to say that the sum of the parts of this King's speech in no way has even neared the rhetoric of what he's saying about difficult long-term decisions for a brighter future for the country. If it's in there, it's very buried.
So what then is your best guess as to when I need to book holidays so that I avoid covering the general election for
Neil,
time?
You will not be avoiding covering the general election, and my spidey senses tell me that if you were out of the country, you might get
It might get a boss call.
You might get the boss call. I like to do it in that voice.
But do you think it's going to be before or after then, the autumn statement? Because that's the key thing. I have to say, my money's now going on March or May next year.
All I will say to you is that the final Rigby a Camphor holiday for 2024 is February half term, and then I am grounded in the country, maybe sneak away in August. In terms of the timing of an election, a Prime Minister, I still think this, he needs the economy to be ticking up, because what he needs is for people to feel like the difficult decisions that he said he would take about halving inflation and growing the economy, that it's beginning to come good. And then the argument will be, stick with us, we've got through this, don't risk it on that lot. You know, that will be the framing. So my instinct still is that this is a Prime Minister that, at the end of the day, if you get to March, April, and you're still 20 points behind in the polls, why would you call an election? Because you're not within touching distance at that point of beating Labour. So you need the polls to narrow first. So in a way, the way I judge it in terms of trying to guess this is I look at two things, like how much of the polls narrowed and what's going on with the economy. And I think those two factors, if I was advising him, which I am not, I would say that they would be the things that would determine when they go. I mean, I know Labour are of the view that they think that they will go in May. But, you know, it's turkeys voting for Christmas. If you're Prime Minister and you rather like the job and you like being able to announce a smoking ban, I mean, you know, for all of the kind of, oh, it's a bit piecemeal, you know, he's put into place something he clearly really believes in, and he will get it passed into law, right? So if you have the power to do that on things you really care about, are you just going to give that all up early, are you?
Beth, it is always a pleasure to have you in. I will take your words as to when to book my holiday under advisement, and we'll see you again soon.
It's an absolute pleasure.
And that is your lot for this edition of the Sky News Daily. We'll see you next time.